This segment, a surprise at the governing body level, a suggestion that the date be moved. Ray Franz goes on, the chairman's committee, consisting of Albert Schroeder, chairman, Karl Klein, and Grant Suter, now produced a most unusual document. They supplied a copy to each member of the governing body. Briefly put, these three men were suggesting that rather than applying to people living in 1914, the expression this generation would begin applying as of 1957, 43 years later. Then Franz reproduces the photocopy of the sheet that Suter, Klein, and Schroeder gave to the governing body. And on that sheet, I was astonished to see that they referred to the works of Christendom as being somehow a better light on the subject of this generation than the governing body had been promoting for, well, since their inception in the year 1972, and before that, of course, in the publications usually produced by the presidents and their helpers over the previous two generations. And among the works that are referred to in this suggestion that we move the date to 1957 were books, what seemed to be major commentary sets that might have been in the Bethel Library at the time, such as Lange's commentary and the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. More about that in a few minutes. One alarming thing I found too was that this document presented to the governing body misspelled the word phenomena 3 times. So nobody seems to have noticed that it was misspelled, which for me proves an alarming level of illiteracy at the highest levels of the society. And at the end of the document, which is only a page long, the society, after quoting the scholars of Christendom, that is, the committee, after quoting the scholars of Christendom, then gets confirmation for their views in the work of Pastor Russell, who apparently knew this idea that the signs had something to do with the celestial phenomena as far back as the 1880s and 90s. So Ray Franz goes on, 1917 marked the year when the first Russian Sputnik was launched into Earth's outer space. Evidently, the chairman's committee felt that that event could be accepted as marking the start of the fulfillment of these words of Jesus from Matthew 24. The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Based on that application, their conclusion would be as they stated. Then this generation would refer to contemporary mankind living as knowledgeable ones from 1957 onward. The three men were not suggesting that 1914 be dropped. It would stay as the end of the Gentile times. But this generation would not begin applying until 1957. In view of the swiftly diminishing numbers of the 1914 generation, this new application of the phrase could undoubtedly prove even more helpful than some person allegedly living to 130 years old in a certain section of the Soviet Union. As compared with starting in 1914, this new 1957 starting date would give an additional 43 years for the period embraced by the expression this generation to reach. Governing body standards required that for any committee to recommend something, there should be unanimous agreement among the committee members. Otherwise, the divided viewpoint should be presented to the body for settlement. The presentation of the novel idea regarding 1957 was therefore one upon which the three members of the chairman's committee must have agreed. I would think that if asked about this presentation today, the response would be, oh, that was just a suggestion, possibly. But if so, it was a suggestion seriously made. And for Albert Schroeder, Karl Klein, and Grant Suter to bring such a suggestion to the governing body, they must have been willing in their own minds to see the suggested change made. If indeed their belief and conviction as to the Society's long time teaching about this generation, as applying from 1914 onward, had been strong, firm, unequivocal, they certainly would never have come forward with the new interpretation they offered. The governing body did not accept the new view proposed by these members. The comments made showed that many considered it fanciful. The fact remains, however, that governing body members Schroeder, Klein, and Suter presented their ideas as a serious proposition, revealing their own lack of conviction as to the solidity of the existing teaching on the subject. To this day, however, bold, positive, forceful statements regarding 1914 and this generation continue to be published as biblically established fact by the Prophet Organization, and all of Jehovah's Witnesses are urged to put full trust in this and carry the message about it to other people earthwide. And of course, Ray Franz didn't know that this would continue for another decade or more, till around 1995. In an apparent effort to calm concern about the diminishing ranks of the 1914 generation, the same Watchtower that implied that the age limit for that generation's members could be forced lowered to 10 years of age also said, "And if the wicked systems of this world survived until the turn of the century," that is the year 2000, "which is highly improbable in view of the world trends and the fulfillment of Bible prophecy, there would still be survivors of the World War I generation." Ray Franz continues, "By the turn of the century, then, the 10-year-olds of 1914 would be 96 years old. Still, there might be a few of them yet around, and evidently that was viewed as all that was necessary for Jesus' words to be fulfilled, depending, of course, on the acceptance of the idea that Jesus was directing his words particularly to 10-year-old children." I have no idea, Franz says, what the future may bring as to the governing body's position on this matter. By their emphasizing 1914 with renewed vigor, they have in effect made their bed and seem to still feel compelled to lie in it. But the span of the 1914 generation is proving like a couch that is too short for comfort, and the reasonings used to cover that doctrinal couch are like a woven sheet that is too narrow, not able to shut out, in this case, the cold facts of reality. Ray Franz proves a prophet here. It is possible, of course, that somewhere down the line they will feel obliged to make some adjustment. As long as the world figures show some increase, however, I would doubt that they would do this. It's hard for me to believe that they would take up the 1957 starting date for this generation proposed by members Schroeder, Klein, and Suter. And we said something similar to our friends and relatives in 1988, just before we were disfellowshipped, that we prophesied that the society would want to and would have to change the date, 1914, and the last generation idea. And we hope some of them are still being reminded of that prophecy at this late date. Franz goes on, they have other options nonetheless. They could acknowledge the historical evidence, placing Jerusalem's destruction 20 years later than the Society's 607 BCE date. This would make the Gentile times run out, using the 2520-year interpretation, about 1934. But such enormous importance has been placed on 1914, and as has been shown, so much of the doctrinal superstructure is linked to it, that this also seems an unlikely step. Perhaps Albert Schroeder's idea of applying the phrase to the anointed class, an idea that's been floating around the organization for many, many years, might prove more attractive. There are always additional persons, some fairly young, who each year decide for the first time that they are of the anointed class. So this would offer an almost limitless extension of time for the teaching about this generation. And something, of course, like this has happened with the newer teaching of the overlapping generations. The one thing I can say with positiveness is that I personally found the reasoning employed within the governing body to be incredible. I found it tragic that a time prophecy could be proclaimed to the world as something solid upon which people could and should confidently rely, build their hopes, form their life plans, when the very ones publishing this knew that within their own collective body there did not exist a unanimity of genuine firm conviction as to the rightness of the teaching. It may be that when viewed against the whole background of the organization's decades of date fixing and shifting of dates, their attitude becomes more understandable. Perhaps more incredible to me is that the Chairman's Committee members, Albert Schroeder, Karl Klein, and Grant Suter, within about 2 months of their submission of their new idea on this generation, listed the teachings about the start of Christ's presence in 1914 as among the decisive teachings for determining whether individuals, including headquarters staff members, were guilty of apostasy and therefore merited disfellowshipment. They did this knowing that just months before, they themselves had placed in question the corollary companion doctrine regarding this generation. But that is a matter that will be dealt with in the following chapter. So Franz's disappointment and disillusionment at that very time when these discussions were going on within the governing body is quite understandable, given that this would become a disfellowshipping issue among the so-called apostates at New York Bethel itself. All of this could have been avoided if we'd been paying attention to real scholars like F.F. Bruce. We just alluded to Schroeder, Klein coming forward with Grant Suter, who had been one of the top 3 governing body members back in the day before the governing body itself was put together, when it was just a board. Grant Suter, among the 3 of the Chairman's Committee, coming forward using reference books like this. Lange's commentary. Over this set of commentaries was produced before Russell started the Watchtower. And now it's being brought forward as new light to correct the teaching they'd held for 3 generations. By the way, not just these 3 volumes in Lange's commentary, but 12. Then there's this set. The Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, edited by Gerhard Kittel. This seems to have been the other resource that Klein and Schroeder and Grant Suter were relying upon for their definition of the generation. Again, a set that had been published, not in 3 volumes, but in 10 volumes back in the 1960s. It was available as light, and the light that was in it was gathered from light that had been gathered by other scholars over the generations, long before 1914. I find it tragic that that could not be considered, and certainly wouldn't be made known among the rank and file of Jehovah's Witnesses, the governing body members themselves, because Ray Franz had done the same in his research of the Aid Book. The governing body members themselves were going to Christendom to get their light, even new light, that might alter their perceptions as to what the word generation meant. This knowledge is out there. It's been out there really since the beginning of the church. So in a subsequent series, we'll follow up this with the turning point in Ray Franz's decision to leave the society, now that he had found that right at the top levels of authority within the Watchtower organization, what they were relying upon was in effect the shifting sands of men's opinions and not the rock of Holy Scripture.